Hello, my name is James Schultz, and today I'll be giving to you a presentation on the Black Plague. Now, before we begin, I would like you all to imagine yourselves back in the 1300s, a time of castles and kings and villages, before a lot of technology. Now, it's important to note that while this place was called the Dark Ages for religious and scientific reasons, there was a bit of a remark about it about the health of the world, too, in that time, namely the Black Plague itself. I would like to warn you ahead of time that this presentation does contain a graphic image. You will see a warning much like this in the corner of the presentation when such an image is about to appear. If you're weak in the stomach, I recommend you avert your eyes. This presentation is made because of the recent development in the scientific community in seeing that the Black Plague has been emergent in our modern society. It's coming back, slowly but surely. What I hope to talk to you about this in this presentation is the transmission of the Black Plague, the symptoms of the Black Plague, and how you can go about protecting yourself from the Black Plague. First, let's talk about transmission. What transmission is the ability for a bacteria or virus or sickness of any kind to jump between hosts. Now, bacteria utilize something called vectors. What vectors are is a sort of vehicle that the bacteria can use to jump from place to place. It's easy and they're often sheltered as a result, allowing them to not only travel but also multiply. The tricky thing about the Black Plague is that it has two forms actually, the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague. In its pneumonic form, it actually transfers through bodily fluid as well, particularly something called an aerosol vector. Now, what an aerosol vector is it's a bit tricky because it's often confused with airborne. But what an aerosol vector is it's any sort of expulsion of bodily fluids, often through sneezing or coughing or talking, that create a sort of mist in the air, like from an aerosol can, which is how it's got its name. This is important because if the bubonic plague, or the pneumonic plague in this case, can use an aerosol vector, that means it can hang around in the air for up to 20 minutes sometimes, and even on surfaces that can't normally house bacteria due to like maybe antimicrobial properties. This is very important because that means that there is very many ways this disease can transfer without you realizing it. You don't even need to come to contact with someone who is infected. You just need to touch something of theirs sometimes. Now, what's funny is that the word plague that we use today to associate with many different kinds of diseases actually comes from the word Black Plague, the proper noun back from the 1300s. A plague is characterized by two things: high transferability between mammals and very short incubation periods. We'll talk about the mammalian part later, but right now let's focus on transmissions. Not transmissions, incubation period, and symptoms. What incubation period is it's essentially the time it takes for disease to, once it gets inside the host, to actually begin showing symptoms. This is important because oftentimes a disease is invisible until it starts showing symptoms, but the Black Plague is 100% lethal once symptoms begin to show. So it is very important to catch the very early symptoms before the real onslaught sets in. Otherwise, the news will not be good. Another issue with detecting the Black Plague is that, well, like I said, it has an alarmingly short incubation period, so it remains hidden for long periods of time, not showing its symptoms. And interestingly enough, one of the most obvious symptoms is one of the last to show. This symptom would be necrosis. Necrosis is actually how the disease got its name. It is the accelerated and early rot and decay of the flesh of the skin. It often starts in the fingertips and the toe tips and the extremities, and then works its way towards the center of the body in large patches. These areas of a host are often extremely infectious and can spread the Black Plague with ease. Another problem with detecting the Black Plague is that it has something called serial mutation attached to it. Now, what a mutation is, it is a flaw in the DNA that causes the original animal to either behave or develop differently throughout its life, causing abnormalities. In a disease, mutations can cause things such as immunities or vulnerabilities to certain vaccines and medicines. This is important to note because the Black Plague is so old and has replicated and evolved so many times that its DNA is a bit on the fragile side. It is very easy for the Black Plague to mutate. If such a thing were to happen, we could have something like the common cold, except with the Black Plague. Now, the reason why I state the common cold is because the common cold has serial mutation. There are upwards of 400 different variants of the common cold, and not a single medicine or vaccine we've developed works 100% of the time. So if such a thing were to happen with the Black Plague, we could have 4 or 5 forms that each require a different version of a vaccine or a cure. This makes it very hard to control the disease once it shows symptoms, so it is very important to be aware of where you are and what you touch. That way you can preemptively catch the disease before the symptoms show. That is really the only way to detect the Black Plague, as it is otherwise invisible until it's too late. Onto the plague bit of things. Now, as I said earlier, the plague has the ability to spread very quickly between mammals. This is important because that means that things like fish, reptiles, birds, and amphibians can't catch the disease, as in that you don't show symptoms, but they can still carry the disease for short periods of time. This leaves them semi-infectious, even if they never ever show symptoms. Now, what's important to know about the Black Plague is that it is highly transmittable among vermin, so like rats and squirrels and small rodents like that. This is interesting note because during the 1300s, rats ran rampant across Europe. Now, the old Europeans believed that the sickness was caused by the cats and dogs of the houses, so they got rid of the cats and dogs. That was a big mistake because the cats and dogs were probably the only thing that could safely get rid of the rats without spreading the disease. So in getting rid of all their house pets, they effectively kind of doomed themselves. One thing to note about the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, or the pneumonic plague, is that it is what is called an opportunistic pathogen. What that means is that, much like something called staphylococcus, or a staph infection, it does not hold well against a fully strengthened immune system. That means someone who is perfectly healthy, someone who hasn't been sick recently, or otherwise, or who isn't of elderly age. But what that does mean is that people who are sick, who have been sick recently, or those who have an autoimmune deficiency, or the elderly who have a weakened immune system due to age, often are vulnerable to the disease, and it often strikes them much harder than what it would in a healthy adolescent or young adult. What is good about the plague, if you can call it good, is that it is what's called a bacteria, not a virus. That is important because a bacteria is a living creature, whereas a virus is not. Viral infections are often much harder to stop than bacterial infections, because bacterial infections can be killed, whereas viruses can only be slowed. They still have to run the process out of infecting and making the host sick. Bacteria can be stopped, can be killed on site, not immediately all the time, but often preventing the sickness from running its full course. Due to this, antibacterial medications and medicines can be issued to help not only prevent but kill off the Black Plague if it were to develop in a host. Another possible measure of defense would be vaccines. What a vaccine is, it is a weakened form of a disease that, while it does per se infect the host, the symptoms that manifest are often very weak or non-existent. What this does is it allows the body's immune system to develop a sort of memory against the disease. This is very important because memory takes a lot of the body's energy to produce, as does defending itself from pathogens. When you are exposed to a disease for the first time, the body not only fends it off, but also has to work on writing memory to defend against the disease once it hits again. That's why sometimes people say you can't catch chickenpox twice, or sometimes like flu or the common cold don't infect the same person multiple times. It's because their immune system has developed an immunity or a memory and knows how to defend against the disease before such problems arise. What is really important about vaccines is that they also generate something called herd immunity. Now, what herd immunity is it is the idea that there are so many people out there that are vaccinated against the disease that can develop quick defenses instead of having to have the body memorize it first. There are so many of those people that the people who are not vaccinated don't have to worry because there's too much distance of healthy and uninfectable hosts between them. This is very important in the case of people like the elderly who have a weak immune system and may actually get sick from the disease, or people who have autoimmune deficiency who can die from the vaccination, or people, for example, like myself. I cannot get the flu vaccination because I'm allergic to the broth it is synthesized in. So I have to rely on herd immunity to keep myself healthy in times of the flu. But the biggest and greatest defense you can have against the bubonic plague is washing your hands. This is very good because it prevents the disease from even spreading in the first place. Medications and medicines are taken often to weaken an already infected hosts. Vaccinations stop transmission from occurring, even though the bacteria is still present. Washing your hands prevents the bacteria from being present in the first place. So it is very important, especially in times like this, to wash your hands. Thank you for your time. I hope this presentation was informative, and I hope you learned a great deal about the Black Plague and how it transmits, how you can detect it, and how to defend yourself against it. Good night.